They laughed at the bride with a limp, until the cowboy said, "She walked straight to my heart." Morning sunlight spilled across Silver Creek, a thin gold line over the dust and timber roofs. The town sat quietly but watchfully, as if it were waiting for something to go wrong. A soft wind carried the smell of bread from the bakery and the sharper scent of horse sweat from the livery. The church bell was ringing, slow and uneven, as if it were nervous too. Mara Collins stood outside the small church, her hands trembling as she held the simple bouquet of wild daisies. Her limp made her sway slightly, her boots sinking into the dirt each time she shifted weight. She had sewn her own wedding dress, pale blue cotton with white trim, a modest thing but stitched with care. The sun made it glow faintly against her skin. People gathered near the steps, whispering like wind in tall grass. Women fanned themselves and looked her up and down. Men smirked behind their hands. Mara tried to smile, tried to pretend she didn't notice the stares. She focused on the road leading out of town, the one her groom was supposed to come down. The letter had said he'd arrive by noon. It was noon now. Inside the church, the preacher paced near the altar. He looked at the space where a groom should stand and sighed. Outside, a boy came running from the post office waving a folded paper. "Message for Miss Collins," he called. Mara's heart quickened. She stepped forward, taking it with careful hands. The writing on the front was rough, hurried. She opened it, and as her eyes scanned the words, her face went still. The letter read, "Changed my mind. Don't want a cripple for a wife. Keep the dress." Her fingers shook. The paper fluttered to the ground like a dying leaf. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone laughed, sharp, cruel, breaking the silence like a whip. Guess he saw her limp and thought better of it. A man jeered from the edge of the crowd. A few others joined in, nervous laughter spreading like a sickness. Even the women who pitied her turned their eyes away. Mara's throat tightened. She wanted to run, but her bad leg betrayed her. Each step awkward, heavy, loud. The laughter followed, echoing off the saloon walls. Her mother had once said shame could make a person smaller than dust. Now she knew what that felt like. Then, through the sound of mockery, a horse's hooves struck the ground. Slow, steady, each thud cutting through the noise. Heads turned. A rider came from the direction of the river, coat dark with trail dust, hat low over his brow. His horse was big and scarred like its rider. Luke Tanner pulled his horse to a stop near the church steps. The crowd fell silent. The left side of his face bore a faint burn scar, pale against tanned skin. He looked at Mara, really looked. Not at her limp, not at her ruined pride, but at the woman holding herself upright in front of a crowd that wanted her broken. "Enough," he said quietly. The laughter died. He dismounted, walked up to her, boots sinking into the same dirt that had swallowed her tears a moment ago. He took off his hat. "Miss Collins," he said, voice rough like gravel. "You deserve better than a coward's letter." Mara blinked, unsure if she should speak. The wind picked up, tugging her veil loose. Luke caught it before it hit the ground. Their eyes met for one brief second. Two people carrying scars the world could see and scars it couldn't. Then he turned to the crowd. "You all laughed," he said. "But she walked straighter than most of you ever will." He paused, looking at her again. "She walked straight to my heart." The church bell stopped ringing. The air stilled, and for the first time that morning, nobody spoke. The preacher's hand froze mid-motion. The sun slipped behind a cloud, dimming the street into gray. Mara's bouquet dropped into the dust, white petals scattering at her feet as the wind carried them toward the horizon. The air around the church stayed heavy after Luke's words. No one dared laugh again. The silence was strange, thick with surprise, pride, and a little shame. Even the preacher's eyes softened. Mara stood frozen, her cheeks pale. She could still hear the letter's words in her mind, but now they mixed with Luke's rough voice. Calm, sure, steady. She didn't know him beyond passing glimpses in town, People said he lived far out by the northern ridge, alone since his family left. Others whispered darker things and that he'd once shot a man. But in that moment she didn't see danger. She saw honesty. Luke bent down, picked up her bouquet from the dirt, and handed it back. The petals were crushed, but his hand was steady. "You don't have to marry me," he said softly, "but you don't deserve to be left standing here alone." She looked at him confused. "Why would you say that?" He gave a faint, tired smile. "Because I know what it feels like and to be left behind." The words sat between them for a long time, as the wind stirred the dust around their boots. From the crowd, a man spoke. "You serious, Tanner? You don't even come to town more than twice a year. Gonna take her out there like some charity case?" Luke turned his head, slow and deliberate. "No charity," he said. "A man sees something worth standing for and he stands." Someone chuckled nervously, but no one argued after that. The preacher cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "if this is truly your wish, we can still have a ceremony." The Lord doesn't need a long notice. Mara's heart thudded. She wanted to speak, to say no or yes or something that made sense. But her voice caught. She felt the eyes of the whole town pressing on her back. If she said no, they'd laugh again. If she said yes, they'd whisper even more. She turned to Luke. His gaze didn't push her. He just waited. Finally, she nodded once. "All right," she whispered, and that was enough. The preacher motioned them inside. The crowd followed, too curious to leave. The church smelled faintly of candles and old wood. Dust motes floated through the beams of light as Mara stood beside Luke at the altar. His hand brushed hers once, steadying her shaking fingers. The vows were short. Her voice trembled on every word. Luke's stayed even, though his eyes looked far away, as if he were somewhere else entirely. When it ended, the preacher smiled. "By the power vested in me, I declare you husband and wife." The crowd clapped, but it was an awkward sound, forced and uneven. Some faces looked pleased, some scornful, others simply confused. But Luke didn't care. He tipped his hat to them all and guided Mara toward the doors. Outside, the afternoon light had turned harsh. The wind carried grit across the street. Mara blinked against it, clutching her bouquet tight. Luke helped her up onto his horse. "It's a long ride," he said. "But you'll have a roof before dark." She hesitated. "You don't even know me." He gave a faint shrug. "Maybe not. But I know what it's like to need a place to start again." Then he swung into the saddle behind her and the horse began to move. The sound of hooves echoed down Main Street, a slow rhythm that followed them until the town fell quiet behind. From a window, one woman whispered to another, "She's gone off with the scarred one." "Better than standing alone," the other replied. By the time they reached the edge of Silver Creek, the sky was already dimming to gold. The town's laughter had faded, replaced by the creak of saddle leather and the low rush of the wind. Mara glanced back once, at the steeple glowing faintly in the setting sun. Then she turned forward toward the mountains. Neither spoke for the rest of the ride. But when they reached the bend where the river met the ridge, Luke said quietly, "You don't have to thank me." "I wasn't going to," she said. Her tone soft but sharp. He smiled faintly at that, the first real smile she'd seen from him. Ahead, the last light of day burned orange across the plains. The wind picked up again, carrying the dust behind them, covering their tracks. By the time they reached Luke's ranch, the sky had turned deep violet, and a thin silver moon hung over the ridge. The land stretched wide and quiet, a patchwork of grass, rocks, and dark pine trees. The house stood alone at the end of a narrow dirt path, built from rough-cut logs, the kind that had seen more storms than visitors. A lantern burned by the porch, swaying slightly in the wind. Luke dismounted first, tying the horse to the post. Then he turned, offering a hand to help Mara down. She hesitated before taking it. His palm was warm, rough with calluses, steady in a way that made her forget the long ride. "This is it," he said. "Not much, but it's home." She looked around. The place was plain but clean. There was a small barn off to the left, smoke curling from its chimney. A dog barked once from inside, then quieted at Luke's low whistle. He carried her small bag to the porch. She followed, limping slightly as the boards creaked under her weight. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "Just me and the dog. Haven't had company in a while." Inside, the house smelled faintly of wood smoke and leather. There was a stone fireplace, a sturdy table, and shelves lined with tools and a few worn books. Everything was neat, careful, like someone who built things to last but not to be admired. Luke set her bag down. "You can have the bedroom," he said. "I'll take the cot near the fire." She shook her head quickly. "No, that's not right. I can sleep out here," he gave a small smile. "You're my wife now. You'll take the room." The word wife hung in the air like a sound neither of them was ready to own. Mara touched the edge of the table, tracing the grain of the wood. "You didn't have to do what you did today," she said quietly. "You'll have folks talking for weeks." "They already talk," he said. "Doesn't change much." She glanced at him, studying the burn scar that cut from his temple down to his jaw. It wasn't fresh but deep, the kind that didn't come from an accident. She wanted to ask how it happened, but something in his eyes stopped her. Instead, she said, "Thank you." He nodded once. "You're welcome." They ate supper in silence, stew from a pot he'd left simmering, rough bread and coffee that was too strong. The dog lay near the fire, thumping its tail lazily. Outside, the wind had picked up again, brushing against the shutters like restless hands. After the meal, Luke stood and went to the door. "Storm coming," he said, peering toward the hills. "You should rest. Tomorrow I'll show you around," she nodded. "Good night, Luke," he gave a small nod back. "Good night, Mara." When he was gone, she sat for a while watching the firelight dance on the walls. It felt strange there, the quiet, the safety, the ache in her leg dulling in the warmth. She thought of the town, the laughter, the letter still folded in her pocket. Then she looked at the ring on her hand or at a simple band, too big for her finger, and wondered what kind of man marries a stranger to save her from shame. In the small bedroom, she found a handmade quilt on the bed and a single candle by the window. She blew it out and lay down listening to the wind outside. Somewhere beyond the hills, thunder rolled low. In the other room, Luke sat by the fire staring into the flames. His jaw tightened, his hand twitching toward a small framed photograph on the mantel. Two young men, both smiling, both unscarred. He set it face down and leaned back, closing his eyes as the storm began to break. The wind howled through the cracks, shaking the windows. Mara stirred but didn't wake, and outside the rain began to fall, and soft at first, then steady, washing the dust of Silver Creek off their trail. Morning came gray and cool, the world washed clean after the storm. The hills around the ranch shimmered with dew, and the air smelled of wet grass and pine. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. Mara woke to the sound of a rooster and the faint clatter of pans. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then she saw the rough log walls, the folded quilt, and the simple ring on her hand, and it all came back. She moved her leg carefully, testing the ache in her limp. It was better than she expected. When she stepped into the main room, Luke was already at the stove, frying eggs in an iron pan. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, his scar catching the early light. "Morning," he said without turning. "Morning," she replied softly. He poured her coffee and nodded to the table. "You sleep all right?" "Yes, thank you." They ate quietly, the only sounds the fire popping and the dog gnawing a bone under the table. After a few minutes, Luke said, "I'll take you around the place after breakfast. Show you where everything is." She nodded. "I can help. I can sew, mend, cook." "I know," he said, glancing at her gently. "You don't have to prove anything." The words caught her off guard. For so long she'd had to justify her place in every room, with work, with silence, with smiles. Now she didn't know what to say. After breakfast, they stepped outside. The storm had left puddles in the dirt and the air felt alive. Luke showed her the barn first, 2 stalls, a stack of hay, and a single old horse. "Name's Jasper," he said, patting its neck. The horse snorted softly, friendly but cautious. Then he led her to a small fenced garden half-choked with weeds. "Used to grow vegetables here," he said. "Haven't planted since." His voice trailed off. "Since when?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Since before I came back," he said finally. "Some years ago." Mara didn't press. She simply knelt and touched the soil. It was damp, rich. "It could grow again," she said. "Just needs care." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Maybe. The day passed quietly. She mended torn curtains, swept the porch, and boiled water for washing. Luke repaired a fence post and hauled feed from the barn. They didn't speak much, but the silence felt easier than before. In the afternoon, a wagon rattled down the distant trail. Luke looked up sharply, eyes narrowing. "We don't get visitors," he muttered. 2 riders came into view, a man and a woman from town. The man, Jed Riker, worked at the general store. He tipped his hat as they stopped near the gate. "Heard you got yourself a wife, Tanner," he said, smiling in a way that wasn't kind. "Whole town's been talking." Luke didn't answer. The woman beside him leaned forward. "Mara, dear, we just wanted to check you were—" "All right," Mara straightened. "I'm fine," she said. Jed smirked. "Sure you are. Just seems a little sudden is all. Man keeps to himself for years, then up and marries the first poor soul left at the altar." Luke's jaw tightened. "You got something to say it plain." Jed shrugged. "Just hope you ain't hiding something out here. Folks remember what happened at your brother's place." Mara glanced at Luke. His face went still. Too still. The air between them grew sharp. "That's enough," Luke said quietly. "You best ride on." Jed hesitated, but the weight in Luke's tone made him shift in his saddle. "Didn't mean nothing by it," he muttered. "Just talk." They turned and left, the sound of hooves fading down the road. Mara looked at Luke. What did he mean? He wiped his hands on his trousers, avoiding her eyes. Nothing worth talking about. But his voice had changed. Lower. Heavier. And she knew whatever he was hiding wasn't small. That night, as the wind hummed through the pines again, she lay awake listening to the crackle of the fire. Luke was outside, pacing by the barn, a shadow against the moonlight. She thought of the way he'd looked when Jed mentioned his brother, that flicker of pain that came and went too fast. Mara pulled the quilt closer, her heart caught between fear and something else she couldn't name. Out by the fence, Luke stopped, staring toward the dark line of hills. His scar glowed faintly in the light, and for a long time he didn't move. The next morning came pale and quiet. The storm clouds had drifted east, leaving behind a clear sky and the smell of wet earth. The ranch looked peaceful again, but something had changed in the air. A silence that didn't feel like calm, but like waiting. Mara moved slowly through the morning chores. She boiled water, fed Jasper, and swept the porch. But her thoughts kept circling back to Luke's face from the night before, the way his jaw tightened when Jed mentioned his brother. When Luke came in from the barn, she looked up from the table. "Luke," she said gently, "what did he mean yesterday?" He paused, his hand on the doorframe. "Best to leave that alone." "I can't," she said. "People in town are talking. If they're going to talk about me now too, I should know why." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he sat down across from her. "You ever try to forget something so bad you'd do anything not to say it out loud?" She nodded slowly. He rubbed the scar on his face. "There was an accident. Years ago, my brother Eli and we had a ranch together not far from here. One night some men came and tried to rob us. I thought I was shooting at them." His voice cracked. But it was Eli. He'd stepped outside. I didn't see him till he fell. The room felt smaller with his words hanging in it. Mara's eyes softened. "It wasn't your fault, Luke," he shook his head. "Doesn't matter what anyone says. He's gone." I pulled the trigger. She wanted to reach across the table but stopped herself. Instead, she said softly, "Then you've been punishing yourself ever since." He didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, jaw tight. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the window. Mara spoke again, her voice steady. "You saved me from shame, Luke. Maybe it's time you saved yourself from guilt." He looked at her then, really looked, as if hearing something he hadn't expected. The moment stretched long between them until he finally stood. "There's work to do," he said, his tone low but softer. Days passed. The rhythm of ranch life settled around them like a quiet song. Mara found peace in small things, mending shirts by the window, brushing Jasper's mane, baking bread that filled the air with warmth. Luke spoke little, but his silence began to change. It wasn't cold anymore, just careful. Sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he watched her limp across the yard with steady patience, never once complaining. Other times she caught him smiling faintly as she scolded the dog for stealing bread, yet the town hadn't forgotten. One afternoon, Mara rode into Silver Creek for supplies. The moment she stepped into the store, the whispering began. "There she is, the bride who got left. Then married the scarred one. Heard he shot his brother. Maybe she's cursed too." Mara kept her head high. She paid for flour and thread, her hands shaking only a little. When she stepped outside, she saw two women whispering near the well. She walked straight past them, climbed onto the wagon, and rode out without a word. By the time she reached the ridge, the anger had turned into something else, sorrow mixed with strength. She realized she didn't care what they thought anymore. What mattered was the quiet life she and Luke were building, one day at a time. When she got home, Luke was splitting logs near the barn. Sweat glistened on his arms. She set the basket down and said, "People are still talking." He didn't stop chopping. "They'll always talk." I told them they were wrong. That made him pause. "What'd you say?" I said, "You're not the man they think you are." He looked at her, surprise flickering across his face. Then he nodded once. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." The sun was setting, turning the sky gold and pink. For the first time since she arrived, Mara saw Luke's shoulders ease. The weight he carried looked a little lighter, if only for that moment. Later they sat on the porch together, watching the last light fade behind the hills. The dog lay between them, tail twitching in sleep. Neither spoke, but the silence this time felt full, not of fear or guilt, but of something beginning to grow quietly, like seeds under soft earth. Autumn crept slowly over the ridge. The mornings grew colder and thin frost began to silver the grass. Each breath hung in the air like smoke. The ranch felt more alive now, the garden turning green again under Mara's care, the barn fixed, the fences mended. Mara moved with quiet purpose each day. Though her limp slowed her, she never stopped. She swept the porch, milked the goat Luke had traded for, and patched worn clothes by the fire at night. Sometimes Luke joined her in silence, carving small wooden figures with his pocket knife, horses mostly, and once a bird that she set by the window. The days were simple, but not empty. Still, the world beyond their land hadn't forgotten them. Every few weeks, supplies had to be fetched from Silver Creek. Luke usually went alone, but one morning Mara insisted, "I'm coming with you this time." He frowned slightly. "No need for you to face that gossip." "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Not anymore." So they went together. The town looked the same. Dusty streets, wooden storefronts, and curious eyes that followed them from porches and windows. But this time Mara held her head higher. Luke walked beside her, hat low, quiet as ever. Inside the general store, silence fell. Jed Riker stood behind the counter. "Well, look who's come back," he said, smiling thinly. "Didn't think we'd see you two again." Mara placed her list on the counter. "We need flour, lamp oil, and salt." Jed raised an eyebrow. "Running a fine household, I see. Guess Tanner ain't such a hermit after all." Luke's voice was calm but steady. "Just fill the order, Riker." Jed chuckled, counting coins slowly. You ever think about coming back to town proper, Tanner? Some folks might forgive you. Luke's jaw clenched. I'm not asking forgiveness from men who don't know the truth. The room went quiet. Jed looked away first, mumbling something about restocking. As they left, Mara saw a few faces peeking from windows. One woman gave her a small, kind nod, the first kindness she'd seen there in months. It wasn't much, but it felt like a crack in the wall between them and the town. On the ride home, the wind was sharp, carrying the smell of dry leaves. Mara looked at Luke. They're afraid of what they don't understand, she said. He gave a small nod. Maybe, but sometimes fear's easier than guilt. Some of them were there that night. They just didn't stop the men who came. She turned to him sharply. You mean the robbery? The one when your brother... He nodded once, eyes on the horizon. They knew, but no one helped. Guess that's why I stayed away. Easier to live with the blame than the memory. Mara's chest ached. You can't carry that alone forever. He looked at her, his eyes tired but soft. I carried it this long, she didn't argue. But when they reached home, she went to the barn, needing space to think. The horse nickered softly as she brushed its mane. Her thoughts tangled like the strands of hair in her fingers. That night, the wind blew colder, rattling the shutters. Luke sat by the fire, silent. Mara joined him sewing quietly. After a while, she said, I think it's time the truth came out. He looked up, startled. What do you mean? You've lived under a lie for too long. Maybe the town needs to hear what really happened. From you, not from gossip. He stared at the flames. And if they don't believe me? She met his eyes. Then they don't deserve to. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he stood and walked to the window. The moonlight touched the scar on his face, making it glow faintly. Eli used to say, he murmured, a man's shadow doesn't shrink by hiding from the sun. Maybe he was right. Mara rose too, her limp soft against the wooden floor. Then let's stop hiding. Luke turned to her, the quiet in his eyes replaced by something fierce and alive. If you stand with me, they'll turn on you too. I already stood with you, she said simply. At that church door. Outside, a lone coyote howled in the distance. Luke looked toward the sound, then back at her. All right, he said finally. We'll ride to town at sunrise, Mara nodded. The firelight flickered between them, bright and steady. For the first time since the day they met, they weren't two broken people trying to survive. They were partners, ready to face what the world owed them. The wind outside howled again, but inside the cabin it felt warm, almost defiant. Dawn came cold and silver, spreading thin light across the hills. Frost crackled under the horses' hooves as Luke and Mara rode toward town. Neither spoke much. Their breath clouded in the air, mixing with the fog that hung low over the plains. Mara's hands tightened around the reins. She wasn't afraid for herself, not anymore. But for Luke. He'd carried his guilt so long it had become part of him. And she didn't know how the town would treat the truth. Silver Creek was just waking when they arrived. The blacksmith's hammer rang faintly from the forge, and a few shopkeepers swept their steps, stopping to stare as the pair rode down Main Street. Luke dismounted first, helping Mara down carefully. You don't have to come inside, he said quietly. She looked him straight in the eye. I'm not standing outside while you face them alone. Together they walked into the saloon, the only place in town where word spread faster than the wind. The doors swung open with a creak. A handful of men looked up from their tables, eyes narrowing when they saw Luke. Jed Riker was there too, sipping his morning whiskey. Well, look what the cold wind blew in, he said. Didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face here, Tanner. Luke stood still. I came to say my piece. After that, you can say what you want. Jed leaned back in his chair. Go on then. We're all ears. The room grew quiet. Even the piano player stopped. Luke's voice was low but steady. You all know about the night my brother Eli died. You've heard what you wanted to hear, more that I shot him in anger over land or pride. He paused. That's not the truth. He looked at Jed, then around the room. That night men rode in to steal our herd. Eli went out first, trying to scare them off. I heard gunfire. I ran out, saw shadows by the corral, and fired. When I reached him, his voice faltered, then steadied again. It was Eli on the ground. I tried to bring him back, but it was too late. Someone whispered, "Lord, have mercy." Luke continued. When I told the sheriff, he said it was an accident, but the town had already made up its mind. I left before you could drive me out. Maybe I should have stayed and fought the talk, but grief does strange things to a man. Jed snorted, trying to sound brave, though his voice wavered. That's a fine story, but that's all it is, and talk. Before Luke could answer, Mara stepped forward. Her voice was quiet, but carried through the room. You call it talk because it's easier than truth. I've seen the kind of man Luke Tanner is. He could have let me drown in shame, but he didn't. He stood up when none of you did. You think that's a pity? No, that's strength. She looked around the room, her limp clear but her chin high. You all claim to be God-fearing folk, yet you mock what you don't understand. You shunned a man who carries more courage in his scars than you do in your pride. The silence that followed was deep and uneasy. Jed shifted in his chair. You think words will change what folks believe? No, Mara said. But truth has a way of settling in, even when people try not to hear it. Luke placed his hat back on his head. That's all I came to say. He turned to leave, and Mara followed. No one stopped them. Outside, the morning sun had burned through the fog, painting the street gold. Luke exhaled slowly, as though he'd been holding that breath for years. Mara touched his arm. You did right, he nodded, eyes distant. Maybe it won't change a thing. Maybe it will, she said softly. Even if it's only in you. They mounted their horses and began the ride home. The air felt lighter somehow, the kind of quiet that follows a long storm. As they rode, a voice called out behind them. Tanner. They turned. It was the preacher from the church. He walked toward them, coat flapping in the wind. You were wronged, he said, breathless. I should have stood up for you back then. The town forgot grace when you needed it most. Luke looked at him, speechless. The preacher nodded toward Mara. Seems the Lord sent you both to remind us of it. For a long time, Luke said nothing. Then he tipped his hat. Thank you, Reverend. They rode on. The wind blew steadily, warm now, carrying the dust behind them. Mara looked at Luke, saw the peace beginning to soften his face, and smiled. For the first time since that awful day, Luke Tanner felt like the world had room for him again. The ride home was quiet, but not heavy. The air smelled of pine and dust, and the sky stretched wide and blue above them. Luke rode a little ahead, his shoulders easier than they'd been in years. Mara watched him, noticing the small things, the way he lifted his hat against the sun, the way the light touched the old scar on his face and made it seem softer. When they reached the ranch, the dog came running, barking with joy. Luke laughed, a short, rusty sound that surprised them both. Mara smiled. I think that's the first time I've heard you laugh, she said. He shook his head. Didn't know I still could. They unsaddled the horses and set the supplies inside. Mara made coffee while Luke fixed the broken latch on the window. The quiet between them wasn't awkward anymore. It felt like two people who didn't need to fill the air to feel at peace. After lunch, Luke went out to the pasture to check the fence. Mara followed, her limp steady but sure. The sky had turned soft with afternoon light. She carried a small basket of mending and sat near the fence post while he worked. For a while, neither spoke. Only the wind and the creak of wood filled the space. Then Luke said quietly, Back there in town. What you said. That meant something. She smiled faintly. I only spoke what was true. He leaned against the post, looking out toward the horizon. When Eli died, I thought God turned his back on me. But today, for the first time, I felt like maybe he hadn't. Mara's eyes softened. He never did. You just stopped looking toward him. He turned to her then, and for a heartbeat, they simply looked at each other. Two people who had both lived with pain so long. They'd almost forgotten what warmth felt like. As the sun lowered, Luke said, "You've changed this place, Mara. Feels alive again." She laughed quietly. "All I did was plant a few things." He smiled back. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Evening settled in golden and calm. The air cooled, and the sky turned the color of peach and amber. Luke built a fire outside, and Mara brought out a pot of stew. They ate together under the fading light. After supper, she sewed by the fire while Luke whittled another small wooden figure, this time a woman holding a flower. He set it on the table beside her without a word. She looked at it and smiled. "You have a gentle hand for a man who used to carry a gun." He chuckled softly. "Maybe that's why I don't carry one anymore." The fire crackled, the dog lay at their feet, and the world felt still. Then, from far off, the faint sound of a wagon echoed up the trail. Luke stood, eyes narrowing. "We're not expecting anyone." Within minutes, a team of horses appeared through the dust. It was Jed Riker and two other men. They stopped near the gate, their faces uneasy. Luke walked down to meet them, his posture calm but alert. "What brings you here?" he asked. Jed cleared his throat. "Word's gone around town about what you said this morning. Folks are talking. Some think maybe they judged you wrong." Luke said nothing. Jed shifted awkwardly. "A few of us are heading up north soon to mend the old bridge by the creek. Could use a man who knows timber and rope. Thought maybe you'd lend a hand." Luke studied him for a long moment. "That bridge washed out 2 years ago. No one's touched it since." Jed nodded. "Maybe it's time we start fixing what's been broken." The meaning wasn't lost on either of them. Luke nodded slowly. "All right, I'll come by tomorrow." Jed tipped his hat and turned the wagon around. "See you at sunrise." When the men left, Mara stepped closer. That was their way of saying sorry. Luke gave a faint smile. "Reckon it was." She looked out toward the trail. "Funny how truth works its way through people, even slow ones." He glanced at her. "You're the reason it did." The last of the daylight faded, leaving only the soft glow of firelight and the sound of the wind in the pines. Mara sat beside Luke again. "Maybe Silver Creek can change after all." He nodded. "Maybe we both can." The stars began to come out one by one, and for the first time the night didn't feel lonely. It felt like the beginning of something new. The next morning came with a clear sky and a soft wind sweeping through the grass. Luke was already outside before sunrise, saddling his horse. Mara stood on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. The dawn light made her hair shine like wheat. "You don't have to go," she said softly. He smiled. "I reckon I do. It's time I stop hiding from the world." Mara nodded, her eyes warm but worried. "Just be careful." "I will." He mounted the horse and gave her one last look before riding down the trail. The sound of hooves faded slowly, leaving the ranch quiet again. Mara spent the morning tending to the garden and sewing a new curtain for the window. She hummed to herself, something she hadn't done in years. Now and then, she'd glance toward the road, waiting for a dust cloud to rise on the horizon. In town, Luke arrived to find Jed and the men already working by the river. The bridge was in ruins, only a few rotted planks remained, half buried in silt. But the men worked steadily, laughing and trading stories. When they saw Luke, the laughter quieted for a moment. Jed was the first to speak. "Didn't think you'd really come." Luke dismounted. "Told you I would." The others nodded awkwardly. Then Jed handed him a hammer. "Good, let's get to it." They worked all morning. The sun rose high, burning the mist off the water. Sweat rolled down Luke's neck, but he didn't mind. It felt good. Honest work beside other men again. No whispers, no pity, just purpose. At midday, they stopped for lunch. Jed sat beside him on a fallen log. "You know," he said, "when the fire happened at your place, folks thought you'd never come back from that." Luke looked at the river, the sunlight glinting off its surface. "I didn't for a long while." Jed nodded. "Well, seems like you finally did." He paused, then added, "That woman of yours, she's got a spine made of steel." Luke smiled faintly. She's stronger than anyone I've met. The men laughed, lighter now. The air around them didn't feel like judgment anymore. It felt like belonging. Back at the ranch, Mara was hanging laundry when a group of women from town arrived in a wagon. She froze for a moment, unsure if they had come to gossip again, but the one in front, Mrs. Riker, smiled kindly. "We came to see if you'd be willing to sew new church banners, Miss Mara. Nobody in town has your hand for stitching." Mara blinked in surprise. "You want me to sew for the church?" Mrs. Riker nodded. "Reverend said it's time to put the past behind us. Thought maybe you'd help." For a moment Mara couldn't speak. Then she smiled softly. "I'd be honored." The woman stepped inside to see her fabrics and patterns. Laughter filled the house. Warm, easy laughter. And Mara realized how long it had been since she'd heard it without pain beneath it. When the sun began to dip, Luke rode back up the trail. He stopped at the gate and saw the women's wagon leaving. They waved as they passed. Mara stood on the porch smiling. "You had visitors," Luke said as he dismounted. "I did," she said. "The church wants me to make their banners." He grinned, a rare and genuine smile. "Seems Silver Creek's finally woken up." She tilted her head, teasing. "Maybe they just saw what I did, that you're not the monster they made you." He looked at her with quiet warmth. "And maybe they saw what I did, that you were never broken." The wind swept through the valley again, stirring the tall grass. For a long moment they stood together in the soft light of sunset. Two people who'd once been strangers, now standing as partners. Inside, the fire crackled, and the smell of stew filled the air. Mara set the table, humming again. Luke took off his gloves and washed up at the basin. When they sat down to eat, he reached across the table, his hand resting gently over hers. "Feels different now," he said. "It does," she whispered. "Feels like home." Outside, the first stars appeared, and the ranch lights glowed like a small promise against the dark. Neither spoke for a while. They didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Winter came softly to Silver Creek that year. Snow dusted the rooftops and smoke rose in gentle ribbons from chimneys. The wind no longer howled with loneliness. It sang through the valley like something reborn. Mara stood at the church door, straightening the new banners she'd sewn. They were white linen with gold thread, words of hope stitched in her careful hand. Inside, townsfolk filled the pews, smiling as they spoke of the upcoming service. Luke entered quietly, brushing snow from his coat. His presence drew a few glances, but no one turned away this time. Jed caught his eye and nodded, a friendly gesture that once would have been unthinkable. At the front, Reverend Hale raised his hands. "Today we gather to celebrate redemption," he said, "and to honor the ones who reminded us that love can mend even the hardest hearts." The words hung in the warm air like a prayer. After the service, people gathered around Mara, thanking her for the banners. Children tugged at her skirt, asking if she'd sew dresses for Christmas. Mrs. Riker pressed a jar of jam into her hands. "For both of you," she said with a kind smile. Luke stood nearby, watching with quiet pride. When the church began to empty, Reverend Hale approached them. "I hear it's your anniversary soon," he said. "Perhaps we could mark it properly this time." Mara blinked, surprised. "You mean here?" he smiled. "Here, in the same place where laughter once tried to shame you. Let's fill it with joy instead." Luke's eyes met hers. There was a stillness there, the kind that comes when something broken has finally been made whole. A week later, the church was lit with candles. The townsfolk came, not out of curiosity this time, but out of respect. Snow fell outside, soft as feathers. Inside, the air was warm and golden. Mara walked down the aisle on her own, her limp steady but proud. The hem of her dress brushed the floor, the sound of each step echoing softly. People watched in silence, no whispers, no mockery. Just awe. At the altar, Luke waited. His scar caught the candlelight. No longer something to hide, but something that told a story. When she reached him, he took her hand gently. "You sure you want to do this twice?"
He teased. She smiled.
"This time I walk by choice." Reverend Hale spoke the vows, simple and true. When he told Luke to speak, the cowboy looked at her and said, "Every step you take is straight to my heart." A murmur went through the crowd, not of laughter, but of tenderness. Mara's eyes shone. "And every scar you carry is proof of the love I prayed for," she whispered back. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife again, the church erupted in applause. Even the old bell above rang through the cold air, its sound rolling across the valley like a promise. Later at the ranch, the two stood on the porch watching the snow drift in the firelight. The world was quiet, wrapped in peace. Luke put an arm around her shoulders. "You ever think how far we've come?" She leaned into him. "Sometimes I think it's still a dream." He smiled. "Then I hope we never wake up." From inside came the smell of stew and the crackle of the hearth. The dog barked once and lay back down. Mara turned her face toward the light spilling from the window. "This house," she said softly, "it used to be lonely." Luke kissed her forehead. "Not anymore." They stood there a while longer, watching the snow fall, each flake glowing as it touched the ground. The storm that once haunted them was gone. Now, there was only calm, and the quiet rhythm of two hearts that had finally found home. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of love, courage, and redemption from the Wild West. Your support helps keep these stories alive, one frontier heart at a time.